Settle in, friend. What I'm about to tell you happened right here in Wyoming territory, back when the land was wilder and men were forced to make choices that would shame or save them for the rest of their lives. I knew Thomas Whitmore personally. Hell, I was there when the shooting started and the gold was found. This story's got everything. A virgin cowboy who inherited more than he bargained for, four widows with secrets darker than a moonless night, and enough gold to buy half the territory. But it also cost seven good people their lives before it was over. Now, some folks say this tale's too wild to be true, but I got the scars and the newspaper clippings to prove every word. Before I tell you what really happened that October when young Thomas stepped off the train in Copper Creek, I want you to do something for me. If this story grabs hold of you like it grabbed hold of everyone who lived it, make sure you subscribe, because tomorrow I've got another tale that'll curl your toes about the Apache chief's son and a sacred white stallion that changed the course of history. Ready? Good. Because this story starts with a telegram that would make any man's hands shake. The telegram shook in Thomas Whitmore's hands like a cottonwood leaf in a prairie wind. 23 years old, and he'd never so much as kissed a woman. Yet here was his dying uncle's final wish, spelled out in stark black letters. Marry the four widows, stop. They need protection. Stop. Ranch is yours if you honor this arrangement. Stop. Reverend knows details, stop. Thomas stared at the yellow paper until the words blurred together. Outside the dusty train station in Copper Creek, Wyoming, the October wind howled across the empty plains, carrying the scent of snow and desperation. He'd traveled 3 days from his farm in Ohio, answering his uncle's summons to inherit the sprawling Double W Ranch, the largest spread in 3 counties. He'd expected cattle, maybe some horses, not 4 wives. The station door creaked open, and a tall man in black emerged from the shadows. Reverend Matthews had the gaunt look of a preacher who'd seen too much sin and too little salvation. His pale eyes fixed on Thomas with the intensity of a man delivering judgment. "You must be Ezra's nephew," the Reverend said, extending a weathered hand. "I've been expecting you." Thomas nodded numbly. The telegram mentioned an arrangement. Before we jump back in, comment where you're tuning in from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Indeed. Reverend Matthews gestured toward a waiting buckboard. "The ladies are at the church. They've been waiting 3 months for you to arrive, ever since Ezra took sick. 4 widows with no protection in this territory, it's a dangerous situation." As they rode through the dusty streets of Copper Creek, the Reverend explained the circumstances that had led to this unprecedented arrangement. Ezra Whitmore had been the most powerful rancher in the territory, but he'd also been a man who couldn't turn away from folks in need. Over the years, he'd taken in 4 women who'd lost their husbands to the harsh realities of frontier life. "There's Martha," the Reverend said, his voice taking on the cadence of a man reciting familiar scripture. "Lost her husband to Comanche raiders 2 summers back. She's 35, practical as the day is long, knows cattle better than most men. Then there's Caroline, prettiest woman in 3 counties, widow when her husband fell down a mine shaft. She's 28. Thomas's palms began to sweat despite the cold wind. "Rebecca's the motherly type," Matthews continued. 32, lost her man to consumption, takes care of the household, raises the finest vegetables you ever saw. And then there's," he paused, his expression growing troubled. "There's Emma. She's the youngest at 24. Lost her husband in a shooting 6 months ago." Something in the Reverend's tone made Thomas look up sharply. "What aren't you telling me about Emma?" Matthews was quiet for a long moment, the buckboard wheels crunching over frozen mud. "Emma's different. Keeps to herself mostly. Some folks in town whisper that she's got secrets. But your uncle, God rest his soul, he believed everyone deserved a second chance." The church loomed ahead, its white steeple stark against the gray October sky. Through the windows, Thomas could see the warm glow of lamplight and the silhouettes of 4 women waiting inside. His stomach churned like butter in a churn. "Reverend," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I've never, that is, I don't have any experience with." "With women?" Matthew's weathered face cracked into what might have been a smile. Son, half the marriages on this frontier start with strangers. The other half start with folks who wish they were strangers. You'll learn. They pulled up to the church steps, and Thomas could feel 8 eyes watching him through the windows. He'd imagined this moment during the long train ride west, but his fantasies had involved one woman maybe pretty, certainly grateful, definitely willing to teach him the mysteries that had eluded him back in Ohio. 4 wives was beyond his wildest imaginings. The church door opened as they approached, and Thomas got his first look at the women who were about to become his family. Martha stepped forward, first tall, auburn-haired, with the confident bearing of a woman who'd learned to rely on herself. Her handshake was firm, her green eyes assessing but not unkind. "Thomas Whitmore," she said, not asking. "You look like your uncle. Thank you for coming." Caroline was next, and Thomas understood immediately why the Reverend had called her the prettiest woman in 3 counties. Golden hair caught the lamplight, and her blue eyes held depths that made him forget to breathe. But there was sadness there too, the kind that comes from losing something precious. "Welcome to Copper Creek," she said softly, her voice like honey over warm biscuits. Rebecca bustled forward with the warm enthusiasm of a natural caretaker. Plump and smiling, she reminded Thomas of his mother back in Ohio. "Oh, you poor dear, you must be frozen solid. Come inside. I've got coffee and fresh bread waiting." But it was Emma who made Thomas forget everything else. She stood apart from the others, partially hidden in the church's shadows. Where the other women had stepped forward to greet him, Emma held back, studying him with dark eyes that seemed to hold secrets deeper than mountain lakes. She was small and delicate, with black hair that caught highlights like raven wings. But there was something else about her, an alertness, a way of watching the door as if she expected trouble to walk through it at any moment. "Emma," the Reverend called gently, "come meet Thomas." She approached slowly, her movements graceful but cautious, like a deer approaching a water hole. When she extended her hand, Thomas noticed it trembled slightly. "Pleased to meet you," she said, her voice barely audible. The moment their hands touched, Thomas felt something electric pass between them. Emma's eyes widened in surprise, and she pulled back quickly, wrapping her arms around herself. "What would you do?" Faced with marrying 4 strangers to fulfill a dying man's wish, how would you handle meeting the women whose lives now depended on your decision? "Well then," Reverend Matthews announced with forced cheer, "shall we proceed with the ceremony? The legal documents are all prepared, thanks to your uncle's foresight." Thomas looked around a circle of faces, Martha's practical determination, Caroline's vulnerable beauty, Rebecca's motherly warmth, and Emma's mysterious guardedness. These women had been waiting 3 months for a stranger to arrive and solve their problems. Without the protection of marriage in the Whitmore name, they'd be vulnerable to every predator and opportunist in the territory. "Before we begin," Thomas said, his voice stronger than he felt, "I want you ladies to know that I'll do right by you, all of you. I may not know much about being a husband, but I know about keeping my word." Martha nodded approvingly. Caroline's smile was radiant. Rebecca beamed like a proud mother, but Emma just watched him with those dark, unreadable eyes. The ceremony was unlike anything Thomas had ever imagined. Reverend Matthews had crafted a special service that acknowledged the unique circumstances while maintaining the solemnity of the occasion. Each woman spoke her vows individually, and Thomas responded to each in turn, promising to honor, protect, and provide for them according to the laws of God and the territory of Wyoming. When it came to Emma's turn, her voice was so quiet he had to lean forward to hear her. "I, Emma Catherine Morrison, take thee, Thomas James Whitmore, to be my lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, until death do us part." But as she spoke the words, "until death do us part," Thomas saw something flash across her face, fear so intense it made his blood run cold. The ceremony concluded with Reverend Matthews pronouncing them lawfully wedded and presenting Thomas with a thick envelope containing the deed to the Double W Ranch, along with documents establishing his legal responsibility for his 4 wives as they prepared to leave for the ranch. Martha took charge with the efficiency of a general organizing a campaign. "Thomas, you'll ride with Rebecca and the supplies. Caroline, you take the light wagon. Emma, you're with me. But as they were loading the wagons, Thomas noticed a lone rider watching them from across the street. The man sat perfectly still on a black horse, his face hidden beneath a wide brimmed hat. There was something menacing about his stillness, like a rattlesnake coiled to strike. Emma saw the rider too. The color drained from her face, and she gripped Martha's arm with white knuckle fingers. He's back, she whispered, her voice filled with terror. Martha followed Emma's gaze, and her expression hardened. Get in the wagon! Now! Who is that? Thomas asked, his protective instincts flaring to life. Trouble, Martha replied grimly. The kind of trouble that's been following Emma since her husband died. The rider touched his hat brim in a mocking salute, then wheeled his horse around and disappeared into the shadows between buildings. But his message was clear. Whatever Emma's secret was, it had followed her to Copper Creek, and now it was Thomas's problem too. The ride to the Double W Ranch took 2 hours through increasingly wild country. The ranch house, when it finally came into view, was more impressive than Thomas had expected, a sprawling 2-story structure built to house a large family, surrounded by barns, corrals, and outbuildings that spoke of prosperity and careful planning. Your uncle built it for the family he never had, Rebecca explained as they pulled up to the front porch. 23 rooms, including separate quarters for each of us wives. He was a thoughtful man, your Uncle Ezra. That evening, as Thomas sat in the ranch's massive dining room, sharing supper with his 4 new wives, he tried to wrap his mind around his new reality. Martha discussed ranch business with the competence of a seasoned foreman. Caroline charmed him with stories of life on the frontier. Rebecca fussed over everyone's plates like a devoted mother. But Emma barely touched her food, and her eyes kept darting to the windows as if expecting to see that mysterious rider watching from the darkness. After supper, as the women prepared for bed, Martha pulled Thomas aside. There are things you need to know, she said quietly, about all of us, but especially about Emma. Her situation is complicated. What kind of complicated? Martha glanced around to make sure they weren't overheard. Her husband wasn't just shot, Thomas. He was murdered, and the man who killed him has been hunting Emma ever since, trying to get his hands on something her husband left behind. Thomas felt his blood chill. What kind of something? That's Emma's secret to tell. But I will say this, if that secret gets out, it won't just be Emma in danger. It'll be all of us. The whole ranch. Everything your uncle built. Before Thomas could ask more questions, a scream pierced the night air. Emma's voice, high and terrified, came from somewhere upstairs. He's here! Oh God, he's here! Thomas bolted toward the stairs. Martha closed behind him. The other women emerged from their rooms in nightgowns and robes, their faces white with fear. Emma stood at her bedroom window, pointing into the darkness with a shaking hand. I saw him! The man from town! He was right there, watching the house! Thomas peered out the window but saw only shadows and starlight. Are you sure? I'm sure. Emma's voice was barely controlled hysteria. He knows I'm here. He knows about the map. The word hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Map? Thomas asked. Emma's hand flew to her mouth as if she could call the word back. The other women exchanged meaningful glances, and Thomas realized he'd stumbled onto the secret that had brought danger to his doorstep on his very first night as a married man. Emma, Martha said gently, maybe it's time to tell him everything. Emma sank onto her bed, her small frame shaking with exhaustion and fear. When she looked up at Thomas, her dark eyes held the desperate look of a cornered animal. My husband wasn't just any settler, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. He was a surveyor for the territorial government, and 3 days before he was killed, he found something that men would kill for. She reached under her mattress and withdrew a leather portfolio, her hands trembling as she untied the strings. Gold, Thomas. More gold than you can imagine. Enough to make whoever controls it the richest person in the territory. She spread a hand-drawn map across her quilt, its lines and symbols marking locations across the Wyoming wilderness. And the man who killed my husband won't stop until he gets this map. He's already killed 3 people trying to find it. And now that he knows where I am, a gunshot cracked through the night air. and the bedroom window exploded in a shower of glass. Thomas threw himself over Emma as more shots peppered the house. In the hallway, Martha was shouting orders like a seasoned cavalry officer. Caroline, get the rifles from the gun cabinet. Rebecca, stay low and get away from the windows. As Thomas helped Emma away from the shattered glass, he realized that his simple life as a bachelor farmer was over forever. In the space of one day, he'd gone from virgin to husband of 4 women, from poor relation to wealthy rancher, from peaceful settler to target in a deadly game he didn't understand. But as he looked down at Emma's terrified face, something fierce and protective awakened in his chest. These women, his wives, were counting on him to keep them safe. And whatever it took, whatever the cost, that's exactly what he was going to do. The shooting stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving only the sound of wind through the broken window and Emma's quiet sobbing against his chest. Outside in the darkness, a voice called out cold, mocking and filled with deadly promise. I know you're in there, Emma. You can't hide behind a new husband forever. That map belongs to me, and I'm going to get it one way or another. Thomas helped Emma to her feet, his jaw set with determination he didn't know he possessed. Tomorrow, he'd learn to be a rancher. Tonight, he was going to learn to be a protector. But first, he needed to understand exactly what kind of war he just walked into on his wedding night. Dawn broke gray and cold over the Double W Ranch, revealing the full extent of the previous night's attack. Thomas counted 17 bullet holes in the house's exterior walls, 3 shattered windows, and hoof prints that circled the property like a predator marking territory. The message was clear. They were being watched, hunted, and toyed with by someone who enjoyed the game as much as the prize. Emma sat at the kitchen table, the precious map spread before her like a deadly tarot reading. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. She hadn't slept a minute after the shooting. Martha stood guard at the window with Uncle Ezra's Winchester while Caroline and Rebecca prepared breakfast with the grim efficiency of women who'd learned to function under siege. Tell me everything, Thomas said, settling into the chair beside Emma. In the harsh morning light, she looked even more fragile than she had the night before, but there was steel in her dark eyes that hadn't been there yesterday. Emma's finger traced the map's careful lines. My husband Jake was surveying the Northern Territory for a planned railroad route when he stumbled across signs of placer mining old equipment, abandoned claims. But these weren't ordinary prospector holes. She pointed to a series of X marks clustered near a tributary of the Powder River. Someone had been working a massive deposit and then abandoned it suddenly. Jake found traces of gold so pure it could have come straight from the Earth's heart. He estimated there's enough there to fund a small war. Or buy a territory, Martha added grimly from her post at the window. That kind of money attracts the worst kind of attention. Thomas studied the map's intricate details. Jake Morrison had been thorough elevation markers, water sources, landmarks, even notes about soil composition and rock formations. It would take an experienced surveyor weeks to create such a detailed document. Who else knows about this? Thomas asked. That's the problem, Emma said, her voice tight with fear. Jake told his supervisor at the territorial office, a man named Collins. 3 days later, Jake was dead, and Collins had disappeared. Then Collins turned up shot in an alley in Cheyenne, and his office was ransacked. Caroline looked up from where she was tending the coffee pot. How many people have died because of this map, Emma? 6 that I know of. Maybe more. Emma's hands trembled as she folded the map carefully. The man hunting me, his name is Silas Cray. He worked for Collins supposedly as a clerk, but word is he's really a hired gun from back east. He's the one who killed Jake, tortured Collins for information, and murdered anyone else who might have known about the gold. Thomas felt his blood turn to ice water. How do you know all this? Because Jake wasn't just my husband, he was my best friend's brother. And my best friend was Jake's partner on the survey team. Emma's voice broke slightly. Sarah Morrison. She managed to get word to me before Cray found her. She's the one who told me about the map Jake had hidden, about Cray's real identity, about how dangerous this all was. Where is Sarah now? Rebecca asked gently. Emma's silence was answer enough. Martha cursed under her breath. 7 people dead then, all for a map to gold that might not even still be there. Oh, it's there, Emma said with bitter certainty. Jake confirmed it before he died. He managed to send me one last message through Sarah. The gold deposit is real, it's massive, and it's completely untouched. But more importantly, it's on government land that's about to be opened for settlement. Whoever controls that information controls the future of this entire territory. The implications hit Thomas like a physical blow. This wasn't just about money, it was about power, influence, and the kind of wealth that could reshape the political landscape of the American West. That's why Cray won't give up, Thomas said, understanding flooding through him. He's not just working for himself. No, Emma confirmed. Sarah found out before she died that Cray is working for a syndicate of Eastern investors. Men with enough money and political connections to buy senators, territorial governors, even judges. They want that gold, and they want the land it sits on. With the right bribes in the right places, they could control the entire mining rights for hundreds of square miles. A new voice cut through the morning air like a blade through silk. Well, well, looks like the new bridegroom is finally getting educated about his wife's little hobby. Thomas spun toward the kitchen doorway, his hand instinctively reaching for a gun he didn't have. A man stood there tall, lean, and dangerous, with pale eyes that held the cold calculation of a professional killer. He wore a black coat and hat that made him blend with shadows, and his right hand rested casually on the grip of a pearl-handled Colt. Silas Cray had somehow gotten inside the house. How did you? Martha began, but Cray cut her off with a lazy gesture. Your back door lock is pathetic, and your guard dog is currently sleeping off a piece of drugged beef. He smiled, revealing teeth white as tombstones. I've been watching this place for hours, waiting for the right moment to have a civilized conversation. Thomas slowly rose from his chair, positioning himself between Cray and Emma. What do you want? What I've always wanted, the map. And now that I know the lovely Emma has found herself a protector, perhaps we can reach a more permanent arrangement. Cray's eyes flicked over the 4 women with the calculating gaze of a man appraising livestock. You're a lucky man, Whitmore. 4 wives is quite an accomplishment. Be ashamed if something happened to reduce that number. The threat was delivered with such casual venom that Thomas felt rage building in his chest like steam in a boiler. He'd never been in a gunfight, had never even drawn a weapon in anger, but something primal and protective was awakening in him. The map, Craig continued, in exchange for the continued health of your family, seems like a reasonable trade to me. And if we refuse? Thomas asked, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. Cray's smile widened. Then I start reducing your household by 1 wife at a time until you see reason. I'm patient, Whitmore, but I'm not infinitely patient. What would you tell me to do? When faced with an armed killer threatening the people you've sworn to protect, do you give him what he wants, or do you fight? Emma stood up slowly, her face pale but determined. I'll give you the map, Cray. Just leave him alone. Emma, no, Thomas said quickly. It's just paper, she replied, but her voice cracked with the lie. They all knew the map represented far more than paper. It was the key to a fortune, and more importantly, it was the only thing keeping Cray from simply killing them all. Smart girl, Cray purred. Always knew you were the clever one in the family. But as Emma reached for the map, Martha made her move. The Winchester came up fast and smooth, the barrel centering on Cray's chest. I don't think so, you murdering snake. Cray's hand moved to his gun, but he didn't draw. The standoff stretched taut as a wire, with death balanced on a knife's edge. Careful, lady, Cray said softly. You sure you want to start something you can't finish? Try me, Martha replied, her voice deadly calm. Thomas could see the calculation in Cray's eyes, measuring distances, angles, the likelihood of getting his gun clear before Martha could pull the trigger. The gunman was fast, but Martha had to drop on him. Then Caroline spoke from behind a coffee pot, her voice sweet as honey. Mr. Cray, would you like some coffee before you go? It's awfully good. The absurdity of the offer broke the tension for just a moment, and in that moment, Thomas realized that Caroline was holding something behind her back, Not a weapon, something else. That's kind of you, man, but I'll pass. Cray's attention flicked to Caroline for just an instant. It was enough. Martha pulled the trigger. The Winchester's roar filled the kitchen like thunder, but Cray was already moving. The bullet shattered the doorframe where his head had been a split second before, and his Colt appeared in his hand as if by magic. Thomas lunged forward, tackling Cray around the waist just as the gunman's shot went wide. They crashed to the floor in a tangle of limbs, fighting for control of the pistol. Cray was stronger and far more experienced, but Thomas had the desperation of a man protecting his family. They rolled across the kitchen floor, knocking over chairs and scattering dishes, the gun wavering between them. "Rebecca, get him out of here," Martha shouted, working the Winchester's lever to chamber another round. But Rebecca was already moving, not away from the fight, but into it. The matronly woman snatched a cast iron skillet from the stove and brought it down on Cray's head with a sound like a bell tolling. Cray went limp, and Thomas scrambled away from the unconscious gunman, his heart hammering like a trip hammer. "Is he dead?" Caroline asked, still holding whatever she'd concealed behind her back. Martha knelt beside Cray and checked his pulse. "No, but he'll have a headache for a week." "Nice work, Rebecca." Rebecca blushed like a schoolgirl. Mama always said a good skillet was a woman's best friend. Thomas looked around at his four wives, Martha with her smoking rifle, Rebecca with her dented skillet, Caroline with her mysterious hidden object, and Emma clutching the map that had caused so much death. In the space of 12 hours, he'd gone from virgin bachelor to married man to combat veteran. "What do we do with him?" Thomas asked. "Tie him up," Martha said practically. "Then we figure out our next move." As they bound Cray with rope from the barn, Emma pulled Thomas aside. "This doesn't end here, you know. He's just one man. The people he works for have resources we can't imagine. They'll send more killers, offer bigger bribes, use whatever pressure they have to. Then what do you suggest?" Emma looked at the map in her hands, then at her three sister wives working together to secure their prisoner. "We use the one advantage we have. We know where the gold is, and they don't. Maybe it's time to go get it ourselves." Thomas stared at her. "You want to go prospecting?" "Emma, we're not miners. We don't know the first thing about extracting gold. We don't have to extract it. We just have to stake the claims legally before Cray's bosses can move on the territory. Once we file the proper paperwork with the territorial government, that land belongs to us. Then we can negotiate from a position of strength instead of just running scared." It was a bold plan, maybe even a crazy plan. But as Thomas looked around at the bullet holes in his house and the unconscious killer on his kitchen floor, he realized that crazy might be their only option. Martha finished tying the last knot and stood up, dusting off her hands. "There's something else you should know, Thomas, about why your uncle really brought us all together." "What do you mean?" "Ezra didn't just feel sorry for four widows. He was planning something. All of us have skills he thought he might need someday." Martha gestured to the others. "I know cattle and horses, but I also know how to read survey maps and file mining claims. Rebecca's not just a cook, she's the daughter of an assayer, knows how to test ore and estimate value. Caroline finally revealed what she'd been hiding, a small, letter-bound book filled with careful handwriting. I keep records, Thomas, financial records, legal documents, contracts. I used to help my husband with his business dealings. I know how to navigate territorial bureaucracy." Thomas felt puzzle pieces clicking into place in his mind. "And Emma's married to a surveyor who just happened to find the richest gold deposit in the territory." "Ezra knew," Emma said quietly. "Somehow, he knew about the map, about the danger I was in. That's why he insisted you marry all four of us. He was putting together a team." "A team for what?" Martha smiled grimly. "To beat the Eastern money men at their own game. To stake the claims, extract the gold, and use the profits to build something good in this territory instead of letting it be carved up by greedy outsiders." Thomas looked at each of his wives, really looked at them for the first time. Not as burdens he'd inherited or problems he had to solve, but as partners in the most audacious scheme he'd ever heard of. "How long do we have before Cray's people come looking for him?" "Maybe a day," Emma said. "Maybe less. Then we better get moving." Thomas stood up, his mind already racing ahead to the challenges they'd face. Martha, how long to reach the goal site? 2 days hard riding through rough country. Caroline, what do we need to file legal claims? Proof of discovery, proper surveys, territorial filing fees, and witnesses. Rebecca, can you keep this place running while we're gone? The motherly woman's eyes twinkled with mischief. Honey, I can do more than that. I can make sure anyone who comes calling gets a proper reception. Thomas looked down at Silas Cray's unconscious form and made a decision that would have seemed impossible 24 hours ago. We're going after that gold, all of us, together. But as they began planning their expedition, none of them noticed the small mirror propped in the kitchen window, a mirror that had been carefully angled to reflect signals to a watcher on the distant ridge. Cray might be unconscious, but he wasn't the only predator stalking the Double W Ranch. In the hills above the ranch, a figure lowered his spyglass and smiled. The Eastern Syndicate had sent more than one man to recover the map. They'd sent an army, and Thomas Whitmore's crash course in frontier survival was about to get much more complicated. The expedition left the Double W Ranch before dawn. When the October air bit like wolves and stars still blazed overhead, Thomas led the way on Uncle Ezra's black stallion, the precious map tucked inside his coat pocket. Behind him rode his 4 wives, each carrying supplies and weapons with the grim determination of soldiers heading to war. They left Silas Cray tied up in the root cellar with enough water for 3 days, long enough for them to reach the gold site, stake their claims, and return with legal protection. What they hadn't counted on was the line of riders that appeared on the horizon just as the sun crested the eastern mountains. Company, Martha called out, her keen eyes picking out the distant figures. 8, maybe 10 men, coming fast. Thomas pulled out Uncle Ezra's spyglass and studied the approaching riders. Professional gunmen, every one of them, armed to the teeth and riding with the purposeful intensity of men who killed for money. The Eastern Syndicate had indeed sent an army. How much of a lead do we have? Emma asked, her face pale but resolute. Maybe an hour if we push hard, Thomas replied. But our horses are carrying more weight. Caroline urged her mare closer to Thomas's stallion. There's another way. The old mining road through Devil's Canyon. It's treacherous, but it cuts 6 hours off the journey. It's also a perfect place for an ambush, Martha pointed out. Everything's a perfect place for an ambush when you're outnumbered 3-1, Rebecca observed with surprising practicality. Thomas looked at each of his wives, these remarkable women who trusted him with their lives, their futures, their hope for something better than constantly running from killers. In 36 hours, he learned more about courage, partnership, and love than in 23 years of safe, solitary living. Devil's Canyon it is, he decided. Stay close, stay alert, and whatever happens, we stick together. The canyon road proved every bit as treacherous as Caroline had warned. It wound through towering red rock walls that blocked out the sun and created echoing chambers where every hoofbeat sounded like thunder. But it also provided cover from their pursuers in multiple defensive positions if they were forced to make a stand. They'd been riding for 2 hours when Rebecca's sharp ears caught the sound of distant gunfire behind them. They found Cray, she said grimly. Thomas didn't need to ask what that meant. A man like Silas Cray wouldn't hesitate to torture information from anyone he suspected of helping his enemies. If the syndicate's men had found the ranch, they'd find the root cellar, and Cray would tell them everything about the canyon road. How much farther? Thomas asked Emma. She consulted the map, comparing landmarks to Jake's careful notations. 3 miles to the goal site, maybe less. But as they rounded the next bend, Thomas's heart sank. The canyon ahead was blocked by rock slide tons of stone that would take days to clear. Fresh tool marks on the canyon walls told a story. This wasn't a natural slide. Someone had deliberately collapsed part of the cliff face. It's a trap, Martha said, raising her rifle. A voice echoed down from the canyon rim above them, cultured, educated, with the confident authority of a man accustomed to getting his way. Mr. Whitmore, I believe we have something to discuss. Thomas looked up to see a well-dressed man standing on the rim, flanked by armed guards. Even at a distance, the man's expensive clothes, and commanding presence mark him as someone far more dangerous than a simple hired gun. "My name is Harrison Blackwood," the man called down. "I represent certain interests in the territorial development of Wyoming. I believe your wife has something that belongs to my associates." "Nothing here belongs to you," Thomas shouted back, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. Blackwood's laugh was as cold as winter wind. "Everything here belongs to me, Mr. Whitmore. I own the territorial governor, 3 judges, and enough legislators to rewrite the mining laws to suit my needs. Your little treasure map is amusing, but it's hardly legal documentation." Emma urged her horse forward, her dark eyes blazing with fury. "My husband died for that map. Sarah died for it. How many more people have to die for your greed?" "As many as necessary," Blackwood replied without emotion. "The future of this territory requires strong leadership and substantial capital investment. A few pioneer deaths are a small price for progress." The casual dismissal of human life hit Thomas like a physical blow. This wasn't just about gold or money, it was about the kind of future the West would have. Would it be built by ordinary people working together, or controlled by Eastern money and political corruption? "I have a counterproposal," Thomas called up to Blackwood. "Take your hired guns and ride back east. This land belongs to the people who work it, not the people who buy it." "How wonderfully naive," Blackwood said. "Tell me, Mr. Whitmore, are you prepared to watch your wives die for that principle?" On cue, gunmen appeared along both sides of the canyon rim. Thomas counted at least 15 rifles pointed down at them. They were trapped in a kill zone with nowhere to run and no cover except the rocks of the landslide. But as Thomas prepared to surrender the map to save his wives' lives, Emma did something that changed everything. She stood up in her stirrups and shouted at the top of her lungs, "Jake Morrison sends his regards. You murdering bastards!" The canyon erupted in chaos. Hidden charges that Jake Morrison had planted months ago, charges he'd never had the chance to use, exploded along the canyon walls. The surveyor had been more than just a map maker. He'd been a former military engineer who'd anticipated exactly this kind of confrontation. Emma had found his hidden notes tucked inside the map, instructions for triggering the charges using a specific sequence of shouts that would carry to the concealed fuses he rigged throughout the canyon. Tons of rock crashed down on Blackwood's men, turning their perfect ambush into a death trap. The canyon filled with dust and smoke, and the screams of horses and men caught in the avalanche. Thomas grabbed Emma's reins and spurred his horse toward a narrow gap in the rock slide, a gap just wide enough for horses to squeeze through single file. "Move, now!" he shouted. They rode through falling stone and choking dust, their horses sure-footed despite the chaos. Behind them, Blackwood's voice rose in rage and disbelief as his carefully planned trap collapsed around him. When they emerged from the far side of the canyon, Thomas looked back to see smoke and dust still rising from the destruction. Some of Blackwood's men had survived, but they'd be hours digging themselves out. It was enough time, barely. The gold site lay in the hidden valley that Jake Morrison had marked with careful precision. When they crested the final ridge and looked down into the valley, Thomas understood why men would kill for this secret. The stream that ran through the valley's heart glittered with flakes of gold visible even from a distance. Ancient mining equipment lay scattered around abandoned claims, testament to earlier prospectors who'd found wealth beyond imagining and then vanished for reasons no one would ever know. "My God," Caroline whispered, "it's real." They worked with desperate efficiency, using Jake's detailed instructions to stake claims according to territorial law. Caroline documented everything in her precise handwriting while Rebecca tested ore samples with equipment they brought from the ranch. Martha and Emma used Jake's surveying tools to mark boundaries and measure distances. And Thomas stood guard, watching the canyon mouth for signs of pursuit. By noon, they staked and documented claims to over 200 acres of the richest gold-bearing land in the territory. Caroline had filled out all the necessary paperwork, complete with witness signatures and ore samples that would prove the validity of their discovery. But as they prepared to leave for the territorial office in Cheyenne, Blackwood and the survivors of his army appeared on the ridge above them. "Touching," the Easterner called down. His expensive clothes, torn and bloody from the canyon, collapsed. "But ultimately pointless. You have no way to file those claims. before I can have the territorial laws changed to invalidate them. Thomas looked at his wives, these incredible women who fought beside him, trusted him, believed in something better than the corruption Blackwood represented. They'd come so far, risked so much, lost so much, but they weren't finished yet. You're right about one thing, Blackwood, Thomas called back. We can't get to Cheyenne before you can corrupt the process, but we don't have to. He pulled out a document Caroline had prepared that morning, a formal assignment of all mining rights to the Shoshone Nation, whose territory included this valley under federal treaty law. You want to fight corruption with corruption? Meet Chief Joseph Running Bear. I hear he's excellent at keeping promises and protecting what belongs to his people. As if summoned by his words, Apache warriors appeared along the valley rim, not dozens, but hundreds, their presence as sudden and overwhelming as summer lightning. Chief Joseph Running Bear himself rode down into the valley, resplendent in full ceremonial dress, followed by tribal elders and enough warriors to make Blackwood's hired guns look like a child's tea party. Thomas had sent word to the Apache camp the night before, offering them partnership in the gold claims in exchange for their protection under federal treaty law. It was a gamble that had required trusting people his own government considered enemies. But as Chief Running Bear dismounted and approached with dignity that made Blackwood's eastern sophistication look cheap and hollow, Thomas knew he'd chosen the right allies. My young friend, the chief said in perfect English, his weathered face creasing into a smile, you offer my people protection of our sacred lands and a share in the wealth beneath them. This is a good arrangement. Emma stepped forward, still clutching Jake's precious map. Chief Running Bear, this is what my husband died trying to protect. Not just gold, but the chance for honest people to build something good instead of letting it be stolen by those who already have too much. The Apache chief studied the map with eyes that had seen decades of broken promises and stolen land. Then he looked at Thomas and his 4 wives, this strange family that had risked everything to honor a dead man's work and a dying man's wishes. The gold will be shared, Chief Running Bear announced, his voice carrying to every person in the valley. Half to the Shoshone Nation for protection of the land, half to the Morrison family and their allies for the courage to do what is right. He turned to face Blackwood and his remaining gunmen. This valley is now under the protection of federal treaty law. Any attempt to steal what belongs to my people will be met with the full force of tribal justice. Blackwood's face went white with rage, but he was trapped. Even his political connections couldn't override federal treaties without starting an Indian war that would destroy his eastern investors' plans for the territory. This isn't over, he snarled. Yes, Chief Running Bear replied with quiet finality. It is. As Blackwood and his men retreated, Thomas found himself surrounded by his 4 wives and a dozen Apache warriors, standing in a valley full of gold that represented something far more valuable than money. It represented proof that different peoples could work together, that corruption could be defeated by courage, and that sometimes the greatest treasures came not from what you took, but from what you were willing to give. 6 months later, Thomas Whitmore stood on the porch of the expanded Double W Ranch, watching his wives work together in the garden Rebecca had planted with gold from their claims. The ranch now employed 30 Apache and white workers as equals, and their mining operation had become a model for fair labor practices throughout the territory. Martha managed the cattle and horses with the skill of a born rancher. Caroline kept meticulous records of their growing business empire. Rebecca ran the household and the workers' kitchen with boundless energy and warmth. And Emma had started a school for both Apache and white children, teaching them to read the maps that would help them navigate a changing world. As for Thomas himself, he'd learned that being a husband wasn't about experience or expertise. It was about showing up every day with courage, honesty, and a willingness to put the people you love before your own comfort. The virgin cowboy who'd stepped off the train in Copper Creek was gone, replaced by a man who'd found his strength not in isolation, but in the connections that bound him to 4 remarkable women and the community they'd built together. In his pocket, he still carried the original telegram that had changed his life, but now he understood what Uncle Ezra had really given him. Not just a ranch or a responsibility, but the chance to discover that the greatest wealth came not from what you could take from the world, but from what you could build with the people who trusted you to do right by them. And in a territory where trust was rarer than gold, that made Thomas Whitmore the richest man in Wyoming.